Teams, you can POI in whatever way that makes you feel comfortable. However, I would strongly advise against using the mics for your POIs. You could use the chat, or you can use I don't know, like a piece of paper that says POI on your screen or something. Congratulations to everyone making it this far. Without further ado, also please keep your own time, because my phone is currently being used to answer the WhatsApp messages that are happening in the other groups. So if possible, try keep your own time. I will of course try and keep time as well, but yeah, that might not be possible. So without further ado, can we call upon the Prime Minister? Here.
Hi, is this volume okay?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
fine.
thanks.
Yeah. Oh, is it like not convenient for you to turn your video on?
No, because the video connection isn't so good.
Yeah, it's fine, it's fine.
No. All right, thanks. Over the past decade, we have seen a trend whereby people are seemingly more self-reliant and more independent, and therefore have been working in the informal economy and the gig economy. However, in doing so, they have failed to recognize the huge amount of economic repercussions that it has onto them. What exactly does the informal economy look like in today's world? It refers to employment with little to no contract with an actual employer from a firm or a corporation. We see multiple examples in the gig economy, for instance, property agents or private car hire companies, self-employed people like those working under Grab or Uber. Therefore, rather than being an employee, you do particular specific tasks to earn money. For instance, being a freelance journalist, or we see in fact the perfect example in private hire firms like Grab and Uber, whereby you move from a formal economy whereby you're at taxis and cabs to an informal one where, because of the rise of ride-sharing apps, taxi drivers were forced to turn from being contracted taxi drivers to self-employed Grab or Uber drivers. Therefore, we prefer the status quo on proposition. And what does this look like? It means that these workers will be actual employees of a corporation or firm, and you'll be under the umbrella of these corporate employers. This means that they will sign long-term employment contracts, which means several things for them. Firstly, stability and duration of their contract. Second, state regulation in terms of minimum wages and what your employer can and cannot do to you. Third, mandatory benefits in terms of maternity, paternity leave, or even healthcare benefits. And finally, a safety net in terms of compensation if there's any type of retrenchment that the company has to undergo. Therefore, the problem that we see within the status quo is that gig economies are inherently problematic for two key reasons. Firstly, because it's unstable and constantly fluctuating. And second, because you're wholly self-dependent with little corporate influence to help you and to provide you with the necessary benefits you need within your life. And these will shape our two key substantives. First, on why the gig economy leads to workers getting fewer rights, and second, how their side decreases the stability of incomes and jobs. Moving on to the first substantive, on why the gig economy leads to workers getting fewer rights. Recognize that there are two aspects to this. First, the lack of formalized contracts that stipulate the obligations that an employer has onto an employee, which means that firstly, contracts that were state regulated, that could include minimum wage, minimum safety regulations, mandatory overtime pay, or even sick leave, all these are no longer existent within the gig economy workers. But before I move on, yes.
So this debate is not about middle-class workers becoming Grab drivers or people working in taxis. It is about domestic urban. It's about informal construction laborers and other individuals who are informal vendors that are driven by rural to urban migration to force themselves into the informal economy.
No, sir, we disagree with that. We recognize that this debate can occur in a spectrum of cases. This means that it can occur for workers who are currently in the middle income as well, and we see that they want to become more self-dependent, more self-reliant, and therefore they go into the gig economy because they see that they have certain benefits in working without an employer. However, as I'll prove to you, the economic repercussions of this far outweigh the possible benefits from it. Therefore, moving on to why the lack of formalized contracts is bad. The lack of ability to, at the same time, to unionize and demand higher pay from a single constant employer or a trade union is also inherently bad, because recognize that contract providers often have a very fixed price that workers can either take or leave. This means that even if there's a negotiation process, for instance, between a freelance journalist or a property agent and the person who is providing the contract, the person providing the contract often knows that they have enormous leverage over the contractors in the first place. Therefore, the contractors are usually the price takers, given that there's such a small pool of customers and they cannot have the amount of leverage required to turn away these customers from their already shrinking base. Compare this to with an actual union that can fight for workers' rights as an entire bloc and therefore demand higher pay. Therefore, what are the outcomes of this onto the contract the employees get? Within the gig economy and the informal economy, firstly, there's a lack of benefits in case of emergencies. We look at things such as healthcare benefits that can be used under a company are now lost when you work under an informal company, under informal economy. Second, there's inherently lower pay to your workers because you cannot demand higher pay and you don't have a trade union that's fighting for you. As a result, these lack of benefits inherently result in a poorer quality of life for these workers because the lower access to medical insurance and no longer having things such as 13th month bonus that will allow them to save in the future all means that they no longer are able to personally plan for the future, and at the same time, they don't have the benefits that are required to have a higher quality of life in the status quo. This means they are, for instance, suffering from COVID or other illnesses. You no longer have the benefits of having your employer give you these kinds of healthcare benefits to go to the doctor in the first place. Second substantive, on how we decrease stability of incomes and jobs. What is the problem in today's world? We recognize that the gig economy, is inherently unstable. This is because they're highly dependent on fluctuations of the market. That, for instance, once demand for a particular product or service goes down, your livelihood goes down as well. We see this in two instances. Firstly, they could be living on a day-to-day basis. For instance, Grab drivers literally don't know how much they're going to earn every day, and it depends on pure luck of how many people want to take the ride in the first place. But more than that, we see general trends of demand fluctuating constantly. This means that it's very easy for global pandemics to lead to a massive decrease of demand for Grab drivers or other self-employed people within the status quo, which wrecks the employment of these contractors in the first place. Furthermore, the short-term nature of these contracts, given that it can just be for a particular task or a short duration to complete it, means that it's going to be inherently out of your control in the first place, and you won't be earning a sustainable and long-term income for your life. Therefore, what is the solution we envision on our side? These gig economies will now work under an actual corporation, which means several things. Firstly, it enables them to get access to a stable flow of income, which is comparatively less likely to be affected by market shocks, because we recognize that firms can employ other methods to reduce costs as well without necessarily firing workers in the first place. But sure, even in the cases where they are forced to fire workers, notice that it's inherently harder to fire them in the first place, because firms are unwilling to do this because firstly, you have to pay compensation packages to these workers, and second, because you have to spend so much more on retraining when you have to lay off these workers in the first place. Ultimately, it is far harder to lose your job once you're under an actual firm. And finally, because it is a sustainability of these salaries, it is better in the long term as well, because you're no longer living on your constant daily paycheck, but rather you know how much you're going to be making in a month, and therefore you can plan for the long term. This can affect massive decisions, like whether to have a child or not, whether you have the financial security to be able to do these things in the first place. Therefore, we protect the workers who need help the most, go to opening government.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Can we now move on to the Leader of the Opposition?
Hello? Am I audible?
Could you say a test sentence?
This sentence is for the purposes of testing. Am I audible?
I think a little bit, try to speak a little bit louder because you're a little bit soft, but other than that, I think it's fine.
Okay, I'll try speaking closer to the, wait, let me try this. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I'll start my speech now. Okay. The informal economy is critical in providing a bridging mechanism for people to go from poverty to safe and financially stable situations within their lives. What are we going to defend in this speech? Number one, we're going to defend the endemic nature of the informal economy and that it needs to exist in order for people to have better lives. Secondly, we're going to explain that opposing it creates massive harms. And thirdly, we're going to explain that this makes life better for people. But before that though, what is the model that we're defending? So we're going to obviously allow the existence of the informal economy. We won't be cracking down on informal vendors or I guess Grab drivers. There'll be less state restriction on the informal economy. Two things before I move on. The first thing I want to point out is that this debate is not about Grab and Uber. It is not about the gig economy because the drivers here are contracted and enter into a formal registration to the government. Drivers have to give a government ID before they are allowed to drive. And the fact that they are entering into a contract that is observed by law means that the government is watching in the first place. So this is not a debate about the gig economy. What this says about the gov arguments is that these are general arguments for workers' rights, not against the informal economy. And note that the gig economy will exist outside of their debate anyway, so most of their harms are value neutral. But also, even assuming that's true, if these people are flexible, want money, and consent to the risk, why is it fair to oppose these opportunities for them when many of them don't even want to be there, but are there only because it is their only alternative? Secondly, we also want to point out that people don't want to be in the informal sector. We accept that lower wages exist. We accept that there might be an unstable relationship between the laborer and the employer. But the reason that they are forced to enter into these things is, one, because registered informal employment has just so many barriers. You need to have a basic level of credit and basic skills as well as a short up resume. You need typically an education, at least a high school one, which many people don't have access to. You need connections and the ability to access the city center in order to get licenses to practice as a practitioner, for example. So genuinely, many people don't have the opportunity, at the very least in the beginning stages of their life, to enter into the formal economy. And yes, it is true that the contractors have leverage over them, but opposing these things, driving out informal contractors off the market, reduces opportunities for people, which reduces the amount of informal contractors in the market, which means that there are less opportunities for these people, which means the leverage actually increases on gov side. So in a world where there are plenty of informal contractors, the leverage actually comparatively decreases, because in order to get workers from one company away from another company, they have to raise the wages that they give to these people, which simply means that the mechanism that gov provides actually reduces the amount of wages and benefits that these people get. So at the end of these rebuttal chunks, what have we proven to you? One, Ogee missed the debate, but we were generous enough to assume that even if these things still apply to the informal economy, they don't matter. But secondly, we also pointed out that this leverage gets worse in the form that government wants. I'll take a point from CG. I can't hear you, Nacho. Okay, I might just have to cut the POI short because I can't hear you.
Sorry. Hello?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, just run through it.
This is not a debate about banning the informal economy. This is an assessment of whether or not the informal economy has done good or bad, in which case whether or not it is possible to ban is not part of this debate.
Oh, no, but so Gov gives a model about how we will introduce regulation into the market, so that's what we were responding to, but the first argument will work in both worlds anyway. So this is why the informal economy was directly created by the process of urbanization and was really, really important for people without the means. So what created the informal economy? When people migrated from the provinces to urbanized centers, or when just jobs were lost by virtue of some global recession or economic shock, it created unemployment in urban sectors which the gap was filled by the rural economy. So clear examples of this are informal vendors or domestic work such as house help. This looks like bodegas that many people in ghettos rely on in order to get food, or informal construction projects that hire people informally in order to build things like roads and hospitals. Why are these things important? For structural reasons. The first is that due to the pre-existing barriers we mentioned, oftentimes the formal economy is not a valuable or valid position for people to take by virtue of the fact that they just get outcompeted by people that want these jobs in the first place. This means that there aren't enough job positions with all the benefits Gov wants. So even if they get better jobs, they have less jobs for more people. But secondly, this means that when you have a stable income, so at the very least you're making money while you're a working student, or you have an informal income to supplant the formal wage you get from your job, it means that when you lose your job, you have comparatively more stability because you can rely on the second job you have or on the money that you were able to save up. Thirdly, you can also acquire connections. You can form work support groups and gain referrals into unions and into other jobs when you've acquired enough skill and can show up your resume. This provides a transition for more formal jobs, which gets the benefits Gov wants. But fourthly, these jobs are also important to service people of lower income brackets. A person in a lower income neighborhood might not be able to afford to go to a market in order to get food. So they rely on informal vendors, which provides cheap
Point of
sustenance.
information.
Construction companies in rural places all over Southeast Asia use infrastructure projects with informal laborers to build things like roads and hospitals because the city center to get a license was just too inaccessible and too far. You can't oppose these things if it is the only alternative for many people. The only alternative is to have roads so that food can get to their places. The only alternative to get hospitals in order for their poor town that can't hire a formal corporation to get money, healthcare, and services.
Point of
But
information,
more
sir.
than that, formal registration also raises prices for many people. It creates barriers for people in lower income communities. So when you have an inaccessible structure, it either requires expensive trips to more urbanized centers to get licenses, which means that prices raise because the cost to become a business also raises, or you require fees for these things, which can be very exorbitant for many of these people. But in addition to that, it also means that just many businesses close down. If you force everyone to be in the formal economy, many businesses just would not exist in the first place. Many poor bodegas that people rely on in places like Detroit and in a variety of towns in Arizona would not be able to get food without this formal economy. But lastly, very often, the informal economy can be a reaction to the existence of unnecessary restrictive policies. When India required corporations to make a formal request to the government every time they hired or fired someone, this just became too much, and eventually the economy around it reacted such that people worked without registration because registration made things impossible to work. Lastly then, this fundamentally is about the trade-off. Even if you get better benefits on Gov, what we've proven to you is that UP has more jobs for people. So overall, employment just creates more harms because some money is obviously better than no money, but also some money can be saved up to create financial stability. And this money is useful in order to do things like pay for healthcare and bills. But in addition to that, it also, unemployment just like drastically increases suicide rates around the world and hopelessness and the feelings of despair. But lastly, we also proved to you that even if benefits are good for plenty of people, it's only good for the people that get into these formal jobs. Government doesn't give us a meaningful way of creating more jobs, which means that the amount of jobs that you currently have are restricted to those that outcompete other people. What does this mean? UP defends the people that need these jobs the most. We think it's terrible and hideous to oppose an informal economy that ensures people have financial stability and a basic path to freedom. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Leader of the Opposition. Can we now carry on with the Deputy Prime Minister?
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I'm going to do three things in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to explain why OO is out of the debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what happens when we oppose the informal economy, even assuming this were a practical debate. And lastly, and after that, I'm going to argue about why specifically it is not a binary decision whether or not we have employment or contract or unemployment or contracted employment. And finally, I'll talk about why we actually decrease for the propensity of employee abuse. Firstly, why is OO out of this debate? They told us that the informal economy is specific to the self-employment of self-employed individuals, right? So these are your small cottage industries which do not have formal contracts with each other. I think that this debate has to take into account the change in status quo, because what's happening right now is a trend that is occurring where more and more companies and more and more jobs are becoming informal jobs that were previously formal jobs. So for example, Grab and Uber reduced the formality of the taxi market at the point at which new technological developments led towards a lower demand of taxi drivers, thus allowing people to book Grabs whenever they want. This is true also for example, gig jobs, where rather than hiring a journalist, you can get a freelance journalist, for example, or a freelance individual to do the job for you. Why is this worse for individuals that they say they were so desperate to protect? Because what they were essentially describing on opposition bench was still regular employment, where individuals still have a form of contract, even if, for example, it is not licensed by the government. What they have to argue against, what they have to support, for example, is rather than hiring a maid from the village as a regularly contracted maid under an agency, you smuggle a human being over without any formal employment, without, for example, a passport, while holding on to their passports, for example, telling them you have to work for us. We see a situation where rather than helping these individuals, you make it far worse for them. Second question in this debate: which side of the house, whether or not what happens when we oppose the gig economy. Because we say the solution to the problems that opposition laid out of high barriers of entry, of difficulties in terms of transport to the city. Instead of, so the solution to that isn't to simply to ban informal economies, we agree. Rather, it is to expand the ability of the state to account for these contracts as well. So for example, by decreasing the requirements needed to be able to work in these areas, for example, or even increasing the amount of state subsidies for transport costs to the cities so that they can get formal jobs. We say that it is the expansion of the formal economy that is important. Because if you recognize that case was essentially concessionary, right? They agreed that a contracted job was, in terms of its quality, better than an uncontracted job. All they were saying is that all they were establishing was a false binary between an uncontracted job and like the government coming down on like roadside workers, right? Which is literally not what happens. Rather than coming down on roadside workers, expanding the formal economy would mean, for example, the government subsidizing them such that they are able to get contracts and be included in the formal economy, thus helping individuals. We would rather have a world where individuals are helped by governments rather than hurt by them. We say that it's far better when we support the gig economy. Lastly, which side of the house is thus better with regards to employment? Because you have to recognize that OO is now out of the debates in that they set up a false binary that I have now broken. Now let's talk about what this debate really is about, right? This debate is about, oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I think it's a bit disingenuous to call it a forced binary when the comparative was that even if you had better jobs and you had more people in those jobs, you still had way more people unemployed, even if some of those people transferred over, and the harms to that sector of people was worse than the benefits you gave to the other sector of people.
So that's a very common argument against, for example, government regulation with regards to like minimum wage. And the question is then, would you then get rid of all regulations of minimum wage? Would you then get rid of any regulation or like safety hazards in the government? They have to answer this in the next speaker. But then we also point out that by having better contracts, you can also overcome this problem. How? By actually increasing the amount of money that employers pay. It is still necessary that these people get someone to do their job. It's not like you can, like, if you have a minimum wage, then employers can do with fewer workers. Otherwise, companies could literally not run, right? They still need workers, and if the only option to get workers is to get a government-regulated contract, then that's the option that employers are going to be forced to go for, rather than, for example, going under a gig, rather than going for a gig economy. But furthermore, we point out that all of the metrics that they provided with regards to the barrier of entry was simply not true, right? You don't need some type of quote-unquote credit in order to be able to enter the formal economy. We don't, and with regards to permits, the solution is simply to provide more permits to individuals rather than, for example, making life harder for them. So moving on to the idea of abuse and government-supported abuse, because we recognize that even if on opposition's bench, they do manage to get a job, it is going to be a terrible job that's essentially equivalent to wage slavery, right? What does this mean? This means that you're still not going to be able to be secure because employers are still not going to be able to be paying you a minimum wage, because without government oversight, that's when wages plummet. Without government oversight, that's when you're more likely to be injured on the job when there's no safety or health regulations on the job. That's the point at which, for example, that's the point at which it is harder to report if an employer like violates a contract because rather than, for example, having a strict Ministry Ministry of Manpower or Ministry of Labor to which you can report, you now have to prosecute every single case of contract violation under your own wages because the government is now no longer regulating your wages for you. We point out that even in our worst case scenario where we have fewer employments, we still bite the bullets. Why? Because employers are always going to be needing a certain amount of individuals, to be able to do a job. Therefore, what that essentially means is that opposition is going to strip away the ability of people to get their employment. But furthermore, we point out that within regular employment, the employers also are forced to do a couple of things for you. Number one, focus on your employee development because you need to be employed for them for a period of years on end. Number two, your career progression as well. These are all investments that employers have to make on you because they need you as a worker. And if you're injured or if you're dead, you're no longer useful for them, rather than a contractor that they have no obligation to protect. On our side of the house, we get larger amounts of employment, we get better employment, you have to side with government bench.
right. Thank you, DPM. Can we now have the dialogue?
Hello, just checking my mic. Can I be heard properly?
Yeah, you can be heard.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to start now. So in my argument, I'm going to be a bit more hardline. I'm going to deal with the worst case scenario of individuals in the informal economy. And I will say, even if they stay and retain their status in the informal economy and working in an informal job, then it is still just and it is still good. It is better than anything else because of the right to mobility that they hold. Before this, a few points of rebuttal that I'd like to give. The first thing I like to do is to also understand what this debate is about. So it's also a preemptive response towards CG to some extent. So yes, we agree. It is an assessment of the good and harms of the informal economy. But our analysis still fits into this type of value judgment assessment because the context is why urbanization allows for rural to urban migration and why it creates more of the informal economy to continue. So it's still important to understand why this status of the endemic reality is still better than any other hypothetical state that they could have lived in otherwise. So we agree it is a bad state with lower regulation, with lower wages, with more risk, with less job stability, but we posit that it is still a good and just better opportunity than anything else. And that's good for many reasons. We provided to this in David's speech, but I'll summarize it very quickly. One, they get some level of money and some level of startup capital to be able to work. And work in and of itself is also valuable. Work, being able to find meaning, being able to see that I can earn a wage for myself, even if there's no regulation, even if sometimes you are overworked sometimes, even if you are sometimes tired, even if you go into many different jobs and you diversify your skills in many simple ways, even if you're somehow desperate as well, the fact of the matter is that work is valuable for you. That opportunity was given to you. You took that opportunity because no one ever wants to always stay in an informal economy job. That is why they still work harder in that job. And even that might be a structural barrier for more individuals, it is still something to celebrate because they make the most of the opportunity and they are able to spend money for their family, their kids, are able to somehow have loans and some rents and to even work with some sorts of banking institutions because now they have some level of capital to hold. Secondly, they're able to have some and learning skills. And that doesn't exist in any other sector, right? You can't hypothetically say the alternative from Ogee is better employment skills training or more jobs.
Point of information, sir.
Because if you're throwing examples at us that can't resolve it, you can't resolve it on your side. So again, go back to the assessment. Even in this bad status, the perception, the opportunity, the access to thinking you have more people to interact with, the social opportunities you have in an urban center is so much more valuable to you so that you can have some sense of economic mobility and working within the system. So yes, it's a bad capitalist system, but I'm working within it and we would rather support that system and why it is better for it to continue to exist. But lastly, there is closer interaction to political and economic institutions in your state. The fact of the matter is, urban centers are where politicians lie, where most political capitals exist, where most people of power exist. And even if you may be some domestic servant working for a very rich family and you are unregulated, it is still important for you to create those social ties, even important for you to have this social work, as opposed to any other alternative, which is the most alternative likely that you would either be unemployed, have no job, never get into the formal economy, or stay in a rural economy and never even travel to begin with. We think this restriction on travel is unjust, and that is why it is simply unimportant to do this. So here's the comparison. These are more meaningful values than the risks and the lower wages for term contracts because of a few reasons. One, this opportunity was chosen by individuals, maybe sometimes not out of their own free will, but because of a rational economic calculation to say that I am worse off in any other
information.
Just take this job. No, thank you. And also that it is still better for you to have some sort of level of buying power, some level of money, some level of capital, some level of recognition that you are somehow working within any economy to begin with. That's why they're still able to work in some cashier job, they're still able to work in some domestic servant job or in some informal construction job because you get the money for yourself that is valuable for you, the purchasing power that any other system could not adopt. I'll take a POI from closing right now. Mike Nacho.
Okay, so the Philippines has been able to regulate a lot of the domestic workers by passing the quote-unquote Kasambahay Act. It is not impossible to formalize the informal economy. It is the incompetence and laziness of a lot of leaders as the reason as to why these things happen in the first place.
Okay, so I want to understand that if it is a debate on the informal economy and its existence and whether it has done more benefits and good, then we would say the informal economy, again, going back to David, is always the transition to more access and an existing market for it to be formalized in the future. So here's how we spin that argument. The informal economy was necessitated for states to be able to allow that continued existence and for it to later on be formalized and for it to be recognized because people had the skills. People were already working in those jobs. And even if they were lower wages, they had the access and opportunity to therefore be better and have a better opportunity in the future. So yes, it's a bad state, but compared to any other alternative where they would not have that opportunity otherwise, it's worse. So the second rebuttal I'd like to focus on then is the worst case. So we posit they can't accept the idea that they expand the state requirements for work, that they can't have better wages for individuals. Because if you want to decrease requirements to work, to some extent, you're leading it towards the informal economy. So that's out of this debate to some extent. If they really want to defend increasing formal employment, formal employment drives more migration, and more migration also drives more unemployment. It also drives lessening social services that can be given to more individuals. So a best alternative is to still have the informal economy exist and persist because that is how people gain skills. That is how you have agglomeration economies and people having spillovers to one another, having more interactions with one another because you are a vendor, you have capital, you have a business, you can invest, you have risks, and you can somehow get a loan because you can now own a house and you can rent something for yourself. These are better alternatives because even if they're very, very low income, it is still better than any other system. So yes, this is good because people make these choices on their own. This is the right to mobility. They have push and pull factors to go into an urban center, even if they know all of those risks. And we will trust the fact that they made this decision because even if there were so many risks that are out there, it is still just for the informal economy to exist because of all of the benefits that were perceived for individuals that could be accessed for these people. And this is better. So we accept and concede. There is poor regulation. There is weak land market regulation. There is less job instability. But the only pathway towards development for any of these people with lesser skills is the informal economy. It is just, it is good, it is more beneficial, and we support and celebrate all of its existence in many reasons. So for all this and more, I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. To open the closing half of the debate, can we have the Member of the Government?
Hello? Can I be heard?
Hi, yep, you can.
Okay, wonderful. Hold on. I'm gonna start now, okay? Our extension will explain why all the problems of a lack of startup capital access are going to be solved, especially given the context that I believe opening opposition is correct about. The more urgent context of the rural poor in developing countries and their inability to access work, I would say the informal economy has precisely harmed this interest. I'm going to do two things. The first thing I'll talk about is access and why the ability to participate in the formal economy is precisely harmed by the informal economy. And this solves the concern coming from leader of the opposition, who says that it is harmful precisely because the quality of jobs of the formal economy are better. It's just that this is a necessary evil that we must take on. The second thing I'll do is explain investment data and why we are better able to ensure that people can live better lives on the ground of the rural poor, exactly what opening opposition wanted. Firstly, on access and the ability to participate in the informal economy. I think the phenomenon described by opening opposition, that it was caused by a massive migration, etc., is not as benevolent as they make it out to be. I'm going to respond in three ways to this. The first thing I want to talk about is that a lot of their concerns about access are not clearly outlined as to why they are incredibly, like, one, still apply today. I think a lot of the logistical constraints that they once initially had problems with is particularly problematic when I think the context of status quo is that we have greater access to things like registration, have more technology to be able to deal with it, etc., etc. Secondly, a lot of the things that they say are simply untrue. You do not need large amounts of startup capital to get a job. You do not need like some sort of high school degree for all kinds of work. This might be true for maybe more specialized kinds of work, but I don't think it's true for all instances, particularly the ones the informal economy caters to. So things like wanting to participate and sell in a a small restaurant, or like a community for the urban poor, does not particularly require you to have a lot of the inaccessible things that opening opposition outlines. Thirdly, so they say that it creates jobs. My claim would be that there's already the existing demand for these kinds of jobs, and therefore this proves that this was necessary in the first place. In fact, like having things like domestic workers in your house could have been formally employed. But I'd say it is precisely the incentives of the rich who did not want to pay them proper wages, who did not want to be able to have proper regulations for them, that ensure that these things persisted. And here's why we say the informal economy precisely detracts from the formal economy. It prevents things like dissent when you can allow for people to have the minimum basis for living, or be able to be happy with their quote-unquote quality of life, when they can already be provided with work, but without the additional costs that governments must incur then. I think uniquely, without this, we would have forced governments, because people would have much more likely opposed the non-existence of jobs and of labor. So I think what this proves is it's not nearly as inaccessible as they pointed out to be. In fact, a lot of the time it acts as a smokescreen, because people are simply unable to access the formal economy simply because of the massive government incentives to prop up the informal economy. The second thing I'll talk about is this is a new extension on macroeconomic data. What I will explain in my speech is why the unmeasurable nature of the informal economy is particularly damaging for both macroeconomic and microeconomic decisions. I'll start from the ground up. I think figures of unemployment, GDP, and other measures of growth do not account for the informal sector, simply because there's no way to do it, because it's not declared, many reasons. How does this affect individuals on the ground? The first thing I'll say is that many individuals cannot declare their employment. And I'd say this is a particularly important conditions for things like being able to access government benefits, like subsidies, like being able to access a loan, or even financial institutions wanting to give you a loan by first proving that you have some degrees of sources of income. But you cannot do that, because one, this is tax evasion, therefore it cannot be declared to the government. Two, are largely unrecognized on an institutional basis. I would make the claim then that if small businesses had greater access to government ways of registration and incorporation, it would have been much better in trying to ensure that they can do things like access employment benefits from the government, access loans that could have been much better. And I'd say terrible. The inability for you to access a fair loan that is much safer, that does not come from loan sharks, is particularly damaging, especially for individuals from poor neighborhoods. No, thank you. Secondly, I'll talk about the creation of small businesses. So the explanation of Ogee is, I think, not sufficient. They just say that you're not going to be employed by a firm. I think the difference is small business would have greater ability to do things like incorporate and be able to do those kinds of things. Why is important? I think instead of legal liability, because you are forced to do it all yourself, and that kind of self-sufficiency they wanted to argue, means that you as an individual take upon all the liabilities of wanting to create a small business. If you take on debt, if you lose money, that does not go into a separate legal entity, like a small incorporated business, but rather you as an individual, who, especially if you're poor and make a risky decision, is particularly damaging in your further sustainability of being able to follow a minimum standard of life, because you are now massively in debt, constantly stressed, and cannot pay for many of your basic necessities. Thirdly, I'll talk about the increase of investment. I think the decision of businesses to want to enter in these areas is another reason why the informal economy is a scapegoat for the formal economy, because you are unlikely to want to engage within areas that have a a lot of the decisions for investment exist because you want to look at macroeconomic data, you want to see if people are skilled, if they're employed, if they want to follow their job. Because you can't measure these things, a lot of these areas will look massively unemployed, massively unskilled, and therefore don't have a sufficient enough return on investment for a lot of businesses, and therefore they will refuse to invest in these areas. If OO concedes to some extent that you would have preferred formal economy jobs, you deter them from even investing. Look, even if they could somehow find out if there was an informal economy, you are uncertain about the skills in that area, what kind of people exist in that area, because a lot of the data that exists to inform your decision is simply not likely to be correct, simply because you can't measure these things. Fourthly, I'd say the state allocation of resources is poorer on their side of the debate. Why? I'd say OO, I'll minimize the benefits of OO first and foremost. I don't know how you will get more hospitals, randomly create roads, randomly create large amounts of government investment. But I would make the claim that there's a difference between a poor area and a poor community without an informal economy and a poor area that has one. But in the eyes of the state, they are equal, and therefore we cannot measure relative things like GDP, productivity, and growth simply because the informal economy does not allow you to make that kind of decision. A lot of the time, what would have been much more humane and strategic options for the state to be able to invest in more poor and more vulnerable areas simply cannot be made because you cannot smartly make that kind of allocation without the necessary pre-existing data that might exist. Lastly, on skills. Because you can't, so it's either you don't know the skills of the people in that area, or those skills look unproductive because they don't contribute towards employment or creating GDP growth. It's very difficult to want to invest in a specific sector that might be more strategic for an area because they might be informal weavers, because they might be informally employed in the maybe service sector. But you can't know these things and therefore don't know what proper skills training that opening opposition wanted to be able to better invest in. Lastly, things like macroeconomic decisions like your fiscal policy, etc., and wanting to invest because you want to have greater stimulus, which is largely based on whether or not you want have lesser unemployment and therefore want to stimulate the economy, can't be smartly made if you don't know these kinds of figures. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Member of Government. Can we hear from the Member of the Opposition?
Test, test. Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, everything so far has been a completely privileged argument from government. The individuals in a informal economy face numerous constraints in their personal life. They have children to deal with. They have sick parents to deal with. We say we optimize the human resources for economic growth, and CO will tell you why we increase the development of these people. We increase the living standard for everybody in this economy. First thing, responding to the speaker directly before me. Right? The first thing he wanted to say was that more investment data can improve the lives of the people. We agree when you say there are low-skilled jobs in the formal economy, but none of that deals with the fact that there are certain life constraints in the economy. We're not going to go with OO's demonstration that you don't have enough wealth. Sometimes your lifestyle prevents you from opting into jobs. What if I have a sick parent, right? But it's also subject to things like competition. If there are so many jobs in the economy, if there are so little jobs for these low-skilled workers in the economy and the demand is much higher, you get lower wages, you get lower living standards, right? Even if opportunities do exist to a certain extent, you don't have a solution for when it doesn't. Our side directly contributes to that because of the fact that we are introducing the informal economy. Obviously, people want to introduce themselves into the formal economy. You think you wouldn't get a loan if they could? This is for people that can't do those things. The second thing he mentioned about how measuring data and how there is an inability to control the amount of people, therefore you cannot help people properly. It is preposterous to think that individuals can only measure data through taxes. We have things like census. We have things like government agents going into areas asking how many people want to look for jobs, how many people have a source of income, how many people are employed. And that whole other thing about the abuse of individuals in the informal economy, unregulation. Notice the fact, government benches, that we live in a society that is democratically enforced by criminal justice systems. This means it is not a lawless town. You still get things like the police force. You still get things like human rights being enforced. Sure, maybe you're not able to regulate it as much, but the moment by which you find individuals that perpetrate these kind of crimes, you can still charge them to a certain extent. Where OO focus on social mobility, we will tell you about economic growth and productivity. We will happily defend the fact that gig economies remain unregulated. Notice things like we can still control, we can still gain from this infrastructure. Okay, this debate was stuck in opening half when opening government says that there was no incentive for these people to join the local economy, and OO claiming that it is not about the middle class, right? We are going to tell you that the most important thing in this debate is economic growth. Notice the fact that this is a larger impact than anything opening opposition wanted to give you, because economic growth affects every mother, grandfather, and individual in the country on their ability to sell items, on their ability as a consumer and a worker to perpetuate their life in a society. 3 levels of analysis to this. We gain cheaper prices for every consumer and worker in society. There is a huge demand in the formal economy, but I sometimes don't want to pay a restaurant because I just want to eat cheap food at a food stall. If I don't want to go to Yamaha to learn piano lessons, in a formal economy setting, I can find a senior who I know is equally capable of contributing that, and I can pay that person. This is also allowing me to suit things to my own personal time constraints. I can do different things with more of my time, right? There's more human resources being circulated. And I also get things cheaper. Because of the fact that I don't have to give an employer a cut of my tax, or pay the bureaucracy fees of setting up a business in between, or paying rent on a certain area, I think I can get prices cheaper and more individuals can afford things that are easily more accessible to them. This means in general, you get more individuals who can afford things like transportation, can afford things like education. You get in more individuals being able to utilize the education they go in to pursue jobs on their rise. Also, I believe that we actually increase the development of human resources. The government, the academia, and companies spend billions a year trying to upskill labor forces. Yet they do it in a way that is so slow, and oftentimes there aren't as many retraining programs as government would like you to say. Sure, you may have some in some localized areas, and we agree that they do help people. But the moment by which they don't, the informal economy can step in and help you learn that. How is it so? OO never provided you this mechanism. You can get online training courses. You can learn through vocational aspects, right? You can go out and just cook a bunch of times until you learn how to cook char kway teow properly. These kinds of things mean that even though there is training, in the instances where there aren't, we can properly cater to them. These links of analysis mean there is more of a circulation of money in this economy, more people can get these cheaper goods, and for the fact that you're able to purchase cheaper transport, we think you improve the living standard of people within this economy. But the second thing we want to talk about is the idea of productivity. This is about making the most of everybody's skills and time. It's about being able to not waste your life doing the certain things that the rich people can avoid out completely. The first thing that we'll talk about is the barriers of entry. There are 2 large barriers of entry that we deal with. Number 1, skill. Formal jobs are oftentimes too strict with the job scope and requirement. You need maybe a degree. I don't buy the government's characterization that it's that easy. You need something like a 4 years minimum, or maybe you need to commit a certain level of time to this job. This is not optimal because a large amount of individuals in the economy are not being utilized. They are living unemployed because they have a large degree set. They have a large degree and set of skills that they've acquired through years of education and life experiences. When you have a formal economy, these people have to commit their time to one certain job and one certain thing. This brings me to my second layer of time. A formal job may not only demand working hours, it also demands the fact that there are non-competing clauses and non-conflict clauses that forbid you from having more than one job. What this means in an informal economy when you don't have those things is I can go give legal advice, I can go teach art, I can go educate different types of people in different types of things and propose more good onto society while gaining more revenue for myself. I also avoid the entire constraint of not being able to work around things because my parents and my lifestyle require certain demands from my life. We think this affects individuals in a lot of ways. It also allows individuals to self-actualize in a way that no other house wanted to give to you. We think that this means for the first time, individuals can pursue a lifestyle that actually grants them opportunities that go around their social constraints, but also you are able to channel your passions and find things that you would otherwise unable to do without the possibility of wealth in this equation. Ladies and gentlemen, I also think that both government houses, like Ogee in particular, were quite squirrely with this motion. The first speech from opening government was about how he thinks that, oh, we have to ban the gig economy and Uber is bad. But then the second speaker comes up here and he tells you that all of these things are great that they're integrated all of a sudden. I think what government has to come up here and clean to you the next speech is how exactly are these individuals supposed to get jobs and integrate themselves when there is no ability for retraining programs to occur, and why exactly is that possible? So when they speak of items of change on a mass degree, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Cool. For the last speaker on the government bench, can we call upon the Gov Whip? Here.
Can I be heard?
Nacho, can you say some more things?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sarawat. Okay.
Yeah. You are audible.
I think the biggest problem in opposition today is that they compare the informal economy as it exists today with the formal economy that exists today. That is not the debate, because in a world where the informal economy did not exist, does not mean that warungs, sari-sari stores, domestic helpers of industries will not exist. It just means that they will be regularized or that they'll be formalized and incorporated and regulated by the state. That means all the argumentation we got from OO and CO about how some people do not have the qualifications to work an office job or do not have the qualifications to work as a full-time job are not mutually exclusive, because these things can also exist in a formal economy. You do not use the current characterization of the general formal economy. You have to look at the inherent characterization, which is the fact that the state is controlling them. The first thing I want to do is take out opposition in this debate, and the last thing I'll do is explain why we win over opening government. First, I'll take out opposition. Note that closing opposition's new extensions of cheaper goods and services, no thank you, and higher productivity are derivative of the ability for them to get greater investment, which is what opening opposition argued. So if I disprove the premise that they get greater investment on their side because they quote unquote lower the costs to enter because they don't have regulations from the state, we win this debate already and beat both extensions. So their main claim is, because it's so expensive to be formalized, businesses will not enter, and therefore we have a great degree of unemployment. My first degree of response is to explain why this cost is not that big. I agree, I will not take it out. There will still be some cost, but the marginal cost is small in comparison to the potential benefits that you get under our side of the house. So why is it small? The first thing they make is that they're impossible barriers to entry, like education, experience, and credit ratings. These are not inherent to the formal economy. They are inherent to some jobs. You can have a formal warung or a formal restaurant that doesn't require high school degrees. Secondly, they say the cost of registration is expensive. Miko pointed out that a lot of the registration gets cheaper over time because of the development of technology, which means that you do not have to go back to the main city center to get a permit. But secondly, to a degree that more and more people are formalized, it gets cheaper by virtue of economies of scale. That is to say, you have mass registration programs where some parts of the city center or some officials from the city center go to rural areas and allow all people to register at a particular point in time, which means that these costs are very, very cheap. The third thing they said was time. You have a full-time job. No, that's not true. You can be a part-time lecturer at Midp. It is unclear why it's necessary that regulations or formalization leads to full-time work all the time. I think the strongest analysis they provide is you have higher labor standards. And I think this is where we kind of beat opening government. Because I agree, we have marginally better, higher labor standards. But to be honest, in developing countries, the way labor standards is quite cheap anyway, in which case it's unclear whether or not they get it better under their side. So, but secondly, also that the fact that the government helps them out. A lot of times, government pension programs are subsidized for small to medium enterprises. So this is not big. This does not remove the argument, but it makes the marginal cost that you have as an investor to want to formalize very, very small. What is the trade-off that opposition did not want to deal with? What we said is inherent is the ability for you to gain information. We had minuscule response from the previous speaker. He said, we can get information by surveys. 3 structural reasons why this doesn't work. 1, censuses happen only on a 10-year basis because they're incredibly expensive to hire people to go to different areas. Secondly, unresponded analysis from Miko was that people do not want to declare that they're part of the informal economy because in a lot of developing countries, it's illegal to not be paying taxes, and that's considered tax evasion. So even if you ask people, they will not declare that you give them the information. Thirdly, we suggest that there's no reason for people to participate in these surveys for the reason that there's no structural incentive to make them participate. That's why formalizing is important. Because when you register your businesses, when you file your tax returns, this means that the government has a track of the earnings of your business, how many people you employ, and therefore have the capacity to gain all the macroeconomic data. You have to engage with the reality that macroeconomic data is not calculated out of thin air. It is done through this process, and therefore you have to trade it off on their side. Miko blew up the importance of information in this debate. There was no response. He said the informal economy, even members of the informal economy, can get more capital by virtue of them being able to take loans because they have the capacity now to be hired to show their business or show that they have collateral. Big investment starts entering because they know it's no longer as certain. Know that developing countries are very, very good for investments because they're cheap and they also have high growth potentials. The biggest deterrent is the fact that they have high risk because we don't really know what's happening in these places. So information is important. It's also important for government spending. But let's assume we don't believe the information point. The very fact that these businesses start paying taxes means that governments have an incentive to continue investing in them. How do you win this point now? Even if I believe you have less investment, quote unquote, because some people don't want to spend more costs, that is beaten out by the greater investment by the state, by foreign investors, by larger investors, by the fact that you have greater access to loans and greater skills training, and therefore we beat out that argument from the very beginning because the amount of capital we're increasing beats out the mitigates the potential losses in costs that we have right now. Before I move on, opening opposition.
So the informal economy doesn't entrench itself, and the alternative isn't forced regularization. It is also a bargaining tool against the formal economy because most of the chains rely on the informal sector and laborers, and that is the bridge so that they can later have leverage to register and later be formalized.
I actually do not understand why this is a constant assertion coming from opposition bench. If the only analysis they have is that it's expensive to regulate. We explain why it's incredibly cheap to to register, and therefore this argument no longer stands. But secondly, even if I believe that there's a high short-term cost for regulating, at best, over time, this decreases because in the long run, the fixed cost of you having yourself registered is significantly less than over time you being able to get more money, get more investments. So even if we believe it's expensive, we are able to win that debate because we're able to explain why in the long run, it becomes cheaper. Know that this destroys also a lot of the arguments coming from the opposition bench, because if you believe in cheaper goods and services or productivity, that is contingent on goods and services being produced at a higher rates. If we have more governments, if we have more other people investing, we're able to beat that out under our side of the house as well. The last point I want to make is explain why, even if we believe private investment, which is their only way to have under their side, or the only thing that they're able to change under their side because people are deterred by higher costs, is less. That is still less important than government investment. So the first part is explaining why it's more under our side, but governments are just better at investing for the reason they have greater technical skills of knowing what is better to invest in, and therefore have greater chance for these investments to be successful. Also due to the fact that they have larger capital investments, which means that they can make larger investments as a whole in comparison to small investments of a lot of these SMEs. This beats opening opposition. The last point I want to make is, we agree that opening government argues why I have marginally better regulations. That doesn't make them win this debate because that regulations has to be proven to the extent it really happens. If we believe that the developing countries don't have that many regulations, that benefit is less important than the massive investment we're able to get by information. Economics is not only about money, it's about knowing what is happening. That is what closing government provides you in today's debate. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
I have recognized that all throughout government speeches, not one speech has told us what happens if there's an absolute lack of jobs and opportunities for individuals within the formal economy. We think it's privilege to say that individuals can have better regulations, have better chances for things like loans, when recognized these are individuals who don't even have any opportunity to social mobility and any opportunity to even gaining some income to begin with. Even throughout Ogee in CG, we think they live in an idealistic world and an idealistic economic system where apparently there's enough and sufficient jobs, or certainly they want to expand the economy, the formal economy, to give jobs. But recognize we have given you structural reasons why this doesn't happen, and at the point of which there is a need for an informal economy, we're the side that provides you that alternative. Recognize that for every individual, it's a lot of individuals would rather be in a formal economy because there's higher pension, there's higher health benefits, there's higher insurance benefits. For all the reasons that you say, we think that individuals would far rather be in a formal economy. The fact that they chose to be in the informal economy shows that there is a lack of opportunity to begin with, because if it's true that if it's true that we buy government's characterization that there's a lot of opportunities, that we can expand this economy, recognize that individuals would not even opt into the informal economy to begin with and it will die out. The fact that it's a thriving economy shows that there is a lack of opportunities to begin with, and recognize that both government teams failed to deal with this and were extremely unrealistic. Two things to respond to CG before I move on. The first thing they say is a large point of their extension, which tells us things about why which tells us things about why information is so important, because apparently their extension is that in poor areas governments need information because they need information so that they can have things like investments within these areas. And also, like they say, private corporations who want to invest in poor areas need information and data so that they know where to invest. Recognize, and then we've told you that we don't need things like their disposable income or like employment things. We can still ask them for things like what are the poverty rates, for example, have like research, other types of researchers and like information, and like ask them about what are their plights and struggles, the lack of infrastructure, and this is how it happens. Their response, I have census. Their responses is that census only happen 10 years once. Recognize that this is just blatantly untrue. Annual census happen too, and secondly, you can ask for different types of information. So even if you don't ask directly about how it's only about disposable income, because you say people are scared of announcing their disposable income because it's considered tax evasion, we can just say it's for things like welfare. All poor people have an incentive to give data for welfare, but secondly, poor people don't even get taxed anyway. So if your extension is about in poor areas, you need to if they don't give data because apparently it's things like it's tax evasion. Recognize that poor people don't even get taxed, but also we think that we don't need their employment data to know when to help them, because usually governments use things like the lack of infrastructure within these areas or natural resources within these areas to help them. We need to tell us why employment data is so important. But lastly, private companies not invest in rural areas anyway, so I don't see why they need to know their potential or their employment data, and they fail to prove a link why that information has to happen. We think that there's already no infrastructure within these places, which is why the state builds infrastructure and not private companies. So they fail to tell us why private companies need specific data on like the GDP or employment status of poor people for all the reasons we told you. The second thing they say is that there's in government whip, he tells us things like, it's better if the informal economy didn't exist, it would just have merged into the formal economy, and things like your local warung will just be merged into the formal economy. Recognize if this happens, all those they fail to recognize how expensive labor protection is. They say it's cheap to regulate, it's effective to regulate. Recognize that things like pension, things like health insurance, all these things are extremely expensive. And if your local warung, if the food providers had to provide for all these costs, it will become extremely expensive too. So all our benefits of consumer benefits of how it's cheap, it's accessible, it's a warung for a reason, because it's extremely accessible and it's a cheap alternative for individuals. If they have to include things like all these costs, they're likely to spike up prices, spike up quality, and have a different target market to begin with. That's why there's an inherent need for an informal economy. Also, it's not a policy debate. They can't just assume that it would have merged, because recognize the specific demand for an informal economy means that there will always be an informal economy. The fact is whether we support it or not. First issue, Where are individuals more productive? And recognize that Jerome's extension on human resource productivity is extremely important in this point. They say that, oh, individuals can still work part-time, like for example, MIDP. Firstly, recognize that this is extremely competitive. Like if not, individuals have, there's extreme competition to go into these positions. So if I'm an underqualified from a smaller area with like smaller debating achievements, I can just teach my junior a high school as opposed to trying to try out for MIDP. All these things means it's far less competitive. Individuals who have don't have specific large scale achievements or are underprivileged can easily opt into smaller scales of the economy. So even if I'm not getting paid MIDP level and I don't have all the protection MIDP gives me, I still think that getting some amount of envelope money from my junior gives me some level of economic sustainability. But the second level, recognize we've already told you that a lot of companies have clauses where you can't work or you can't do other things while training at their academy. So MIDP, for example, has specific clauses where you can't train at other academies. This means that for every trainer who works within these industries, or every worker that works within a specific company, they can't optimize their skills, and they're forever trapped under their one employer, which is why we told you that productivity is far less. This came specifically from closing opposition, because recognize the economy can only thrive when everyone is to their full productivity and earning the most that they can. We think that, for example, if I can do multiple things, we're able to optimize our money, optimize our income, and that's a benefit that we get. If we're able to train at 10 different places, for example, or 5 different places as opposed to being trapped under one employer, that's also a benefit, and recognize that individuals can get far more income. Why is this important? We've already told you that given this source of income increases for a lot of individuals can do various different things. For example, you can have online courses, as Jerome said, and gain various different skills and do various different things and earn a source of income. Recognize that this protects individuals from things like automation or global recession. The reason why a lot of people are unemployed in the formal economy is because they didn't have other skills and couldn't diversify their skills because they were always trapped under one employer. This is where we directly clash with Ogee. Ogee says that, oh, you're so protected in a formal economy. Recognize that during the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of people, even within formal jobs, still got laid off anyways because the company just doesn't have enough money to pay them. We don't think that they're extremely secured anyway. So a lot of people that I know also got laid off simply because the companies can't afford. So a formal economy is never perfect anyways. For example, if these individuals had time to diversify their skills and didn't have clauses that trap them to one employer, we think they could have done many other things that would have given them high levels of social mobility and security. They wouldn't be so anxious, because recognize that being trapped to one employer means that the skills that you obtain are also far less and far more limited, which is why what Jerome told you about the diversification of human resources is extremely important. When individuals can diversify their skills, means that they're far more effective in the labor market simply because they have other alternatives and other backups, which is extremely important in a time of things like automation, for example. All these things means workers are far more protected on our world. The second issue, recognize for poor people, all of governments extend material about how things like loans, for example, or debt and worry, because they have to rely on things they have to rely on loan sharks, for example, do not recognize the problem that these are individuals who would have had no money and no opportunity to even climb up the social ladder to begin with. They wouldn't even have an income for banks to give them loans, which is why it's so important. Which is why we think it's so important for them to, even if they live in debt and even if they are anxiety, we think that comparative is still far better because we've given you some opportunity for these individuals to gain far more income. But given your characterization that these individuals will work in menial labor in for example, an office boy in a formal economy, be tied up and have to work overtime, not be able to diversify his skills and do many other different things because that job makes him work so much, that individual wouldn't be able to get a loan in the first place because he simply is tied to that specific income. We think individuals are far better on our because they're able to get many sources of income. This is how individuals are able to climb the social ladder. But lastly, we have told you specifically why certain individuals are ultimately trapped from the employment industry. Because recognize some people have a sick child that they have to take care of. Some people have health crisis, and recognize the formal industry, in the formal employment sector, there's so much competition, and companies, you are at the mercy of your company. Companies can don't need to employ an individual with health problems, for example, and that's why we think that all these individuals are far less likely to get employed. But under the informal industry, they're able to find small gaps within the demand, and like fit in that small gaps. Sure, individuals would have always been shut off if you have a mental disability or a health disability or a sick child to look after. The formal economy simply doesn't need you because there's an oversaturation, but you can fill in the gaps within demand, and you can at least make a livelihood. We are so proud to oppose.
All right, we'd like to thank all teams for the debate.